Welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation, part of the School Climate Transformation Grant Series. Our December webinar topic is Sustaining School-Wide PBIS, 4 research-based tips for school teams. This webinar will provide a set of 4 specific strategies that school teams can use to increase the likelihood that school-wide PBIS will continue to be implemented over time. Our presenter today is Ken McIntosh, who is a professor in the Department of Special Education and Clinical Sciences at the University of Oregon and director of the Educational and Community Supports, a research unit in the College of Education. He currently leads the Center on PBIS Proportionality work group and has just completed a research project funded by the IES, National Center on Special Education Research. That project examined predictors of sustained implementation of PBIS, and he will share those results in this webinar. Just a reminder to our dial-in attendees to mute their phones via *6. Without further ado, I'll head over the room to Professor Kent.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. Much appreciated. Welcome to everybody out there viewing live or coming in on watching afterwards. If you're watching live, you are welcome to add info into the chat if you've got questions. I'll make sure to save some time toward the end so I can answer some of those. I do want to acknowledge support for the projects, for the research that's I'm going to be sharing today comes from the Institute of Education Sciences and also the Office of Special Education Programs, both in the Department of Education. But really the ones who I want to thank are the people who did the work and also all of our participants, over 800 representatives of school teams around the country who were just, I'm just so thankful that they were able to share their wisdom and knowledge and experiences with us. Some of the co-investigators, Sterrett Mercer, who did all of the fancy statistics, and also Dr. Rhonda Neese, who coordinated all of it and did a good amount of the writing and making all of this stuff actually work. And you can see participants from 14 states across the country, a huge number from California and Maryland and Minnesota and Missouri and Wisconsin. Like I said, really, really thankful to you all for sharing a little bit with us. So here's some goals that I've got for us for the time. Number one, I'll share just briefly a little context. We're going to talk through those tips and talk through 4 checks to see if you've got them in place, and then spend a little time talking about how district and state teams can support school teams in their work. So the 4 tips I'm going to recommend are school teams, but obviously people can view that and think about if you're supporting those teams as well. But I'd like to start off just getting a little bit of sense from you all. How many years have you been implementing PBIS in your current roles? You can see, if you're doing this live, you should be able to see a poll that's popping up. So we've got not yet, not doing it. You might be in a planning year, or so what sometimes people call year 0. You might be in your first year of implementation. 2 to 4 years might be that you're implementing as part of the School Climate Transformation Grants as they're just getting rolling out. And then moving on 5 to 9 years, and then 10 to more years are serious sustainers. And so you can see there, over 2/3 are right in that 2 to 4 year range, and that's a really exciting time. It still feels fresh and new and different. It's possible that maybe a little bit of the shininess of it has worn off a little bit, and people are kind of wondering what's next, or people might start taking it for granted, or there might be other initiatives that are popping up. So this is really going to be it's going to be helpful for each group, but I really do think it's going to match very nicely for those in that 2 to 4 year range. So as I was talking about implementation of PBIS, one of the things that you'll see is a huge growth in schools implementing PBIS over the years. So those are actually the years across the bottom, starting at the year 2000 all the way up to August of 2017 is the last time there. And these are actually schools that are supported primarily from the National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. So we know that there are also schools that are implementing PBIS outside of formal support from the center as well. So we kind of view this as a little bit of an underestimate. But even so, pretty impressive. Almost 26,000 schools. There are about, at last count, 95,000 schools in the country. So this is more than 1 in 4 schools. And that's serving almost 14 million students. So this is kind of a big thing. And when we think about this as an educational initiative, it's pretty impressive. But also, it's useful to know that we've got implementation in the United States, but we've got actually have implementation in more than 20 countries around the world, which is pretty exciting to see that it's not just something from here. In fact, there have been schools, for example, in British Columbia that have been implementing PBIS far more than most schools in the U.S. So this is kind of a little bit of a broader thing than you might be aware of. And yet, even with those that widespread adoption and use across the country, we still get very concerned about sustainability. How do we keep this going? And I love to share this graph. This is from Glenn Latham, who's one of the sort of leading voices in sustainability of evidence-based practices, particularly, and positive behavior support. And he calls it the birth and death cycles of educational innovations, which I know is not particularly optimistic right here. But what you see across the bottom is each one of those dotted lines is a year of implementation, or a year, and each one of those solid lines is school implementation for a particular initiative. It's kind of a combination of interest level and implementation. And so what you see there is people getting really excited, implementing something, and then around that third year or so, some new initiative comes in, and then all of a sudden that one that's there is gone and moving on, and everyone has forgotten it, and it continues on and on and on. And so this, you might be starting to get a little concerned if you're in that 2 to 4 year range about, well, is this going to go on? Is this sort of a new thing that's been happening? And I hate to tell you this, but this figure right here, this picture is over 25 years old. So this really is the status quo for implementation science in schools. This is what it looks like in terms of the livelihood of many innovations or interventions or initiatives or new programs or whatever you want to call them. I'm going to show you another chart here in a moment. This one is slightly different. This one describes the life cycles of innovations, and this is a group that looks at technology and society. There's some that looks specifically at technology and education, and don't worry about looking at each one of the little dots. I'm actually more interested in you taking a look at. We still have time across the bottom, and then we have these little phases of implementation that move. So the first phase or stage is called a trigger. What that means is that people start hearing about it, it's new and exciting. Then it moves into something called the peak of inflated expectations. That's the assumption that this one thing is going to solve every single problem in education that there ever has been. And of course, we know that no one thing, even if it's a broad framework, can solve everything. And so then it drops down into something called the trough of disillusionment. And you can see that drops down far below the peak of inflated expectations, and then moves to something called the slope of enlightenment, where where expectations come up, but maybe they're a little bit more realistic, and then the plateau of productivity. So it's sort of interesting to look at this and start thinking about whether you can map educational initiatives that you have seen somewhere on this map. I know that when I was young, we had a computer in every classroom, and that was going to solve every problem. And for the most part, nobody knew how to work it, and nobody knew how to do anything with it, except for that one kid who played Where's Carmen Sandiego all the time, and that was about it. You might think of smart boards somewhere on here. You might think of flipped classrooms. You might have bring your own device or one-to-one tablet to student programs. Any of those things might fit in there somewhere. And I think the fear is to watch out, to know that there is going to be this peak of inflated expectations that's here. And what you really need to do is be aware that some excitement might drop off, but that's normal. The most important part is to continue on with the work and guard against too much of a drop into the trough that it actually ends up crashing the entire system. And one of those phenomenons that many of you might be in right now, if you're in the cycle of the school climate transformation grants, is this idea of looking at where you are in terms of grant funding. So this is a 5-year grant, and you were moving in year 3, moving on 3, 4 in there. And I think the question that you might have is, how do we keep this going? And one of the things that we know is that getting a big grant is actually, it's really nice for implementation, but it is a massive threat for sustainability, for keeping going with this. It is one of those things where it's very easy for people to see this money coming in, and if you don't plan right now, or you haven't been planning for the last couple of years, there's a good likelihood that things will drop off. And the reason for that is if people spend all of their grant dollars simply bringing more people into the school, and there's no way to actually continue to pay for their salaries, that's going to be a huge loss. You're going to be hiring those people, and then you're going to be firing them at the end of year 5. If all you do is focus on giving people training, training is nice, but you know that there's going to be turnover, and so it's not going to be particularly helpful a few years down the road if you spent all of this money training every single educator in the district in 2017, but then you know that a third or half of them are gone in 2020. That's not going to spell very well for your initiative. And that leads to something that Edelman and Taylor call project mentality. And what that means is that if everybody views this as a time-limited thing, then you can get into a lot of trouble. So one little solution that you can work to try to address is watch out about calling this all the time the School Climate Transformation Grant Project. Because that is an indicator to everybody that when the grant is gone, the project is gone. So start thinking about how this would actually blend into the language of your school, the language of your district, how you can fit that into continuous improvement here. Some of the other things that I think are really, really useful, and it's not going to be too much of a surprise, but building local capacity so that you've got, not only have you done training for people, but that you've actually invested in training trainers and multiple trainers, not just one person who's going to be the keeper of it all, and also coaches, so that people are there and able to do that. And when I say coaches, I think it's useful, and George Sugal is often telling people that coaching is really a function or a role. It's not a person. And so if the idea is we need lots of coaching for this grant to work, so we're going to hire all these people called coaches, that's not going to work pretty well if you've got to fire all these people afterwards. But if you can identify who are going to be the people who will do the coaching in our district in a few years, that's great. Now, whether that's your itinerant school counselors, whether that's your behavior consultants, whether that's school psychologists, whoever that is, identify those people where coaching might actually fit somewhere in their job descriptions and move forward. And then, of course, trying to find some stable line item funding. If you have been reading or looking into ESSA, which is the brand new version of the No Child Left Behind Act, you'll notice that there's money available for states. States have much more control, and the block grant function is a great way to start looking at how can we get line item money for continuing our school climate work. And if it's useful for you, here is a new tool, a new brief that's just popped up that Jessica Swain Bradway wrote, looking at what's called a benefit cost analysis of implementing PBIS. And she went through and looked at randomized control trial of PBIS and reductions and suspensions, and how those reductions and suspensions are related to decreasing the risk of dropout, and then looking at what the cost of decreasing students dropping out from school onto society in terms of costs for welfare system, diminished productivity, incarceration, etc. And what she found, which is very, very impressive, and you can find this brief on PBIS.org, for every dollar spent implementing PBIS, it was $105 in savings from reducing the school dropout. That's big, and I think this document will be pretty useful for you in moving from federal grant funding to stable state or district funding. I mean, this just is a no-brainer for a lot of people out there making that economic decision. So one of the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years and with some very smart people around me is looking at this idea of sustainability and whether we can find out what are the things that are most related to sustainability. And I'll show you a couple little pictures here. These are a couple years old, but here's my family walking through the woods in a place with incredible, this is an island out just off of the coast of Alaska, but in Canada, where pretty much everything will grow just about anywhere, on the sides of trees, on the ground, big trees growing up, everywhere. And yet, if you walk 5 minutes in another direction, you find absolutely nothing, the littlest bit of green. And so what you can see on the left side is lots and lots of green, but there still are some parts that are bare. And then on the right side, lots of bare ground, but then still you can see a little bit of green back there as well. So we were really interested in looking at that and trying to boil down some of these big research findings into stuff that's pretty easy to put in place in schools. And so what we came up with were 4 tips for sustaining PBIS in schools. And I recorded a brief video that I think you can still find on PBIS.org about this, but this is a little bit of an extended version of that. So we're going to move on to tip 1 right here. And I'm going to pop a little poll out here for you. And just to ask you this, so you can see that poll popping up again. What do you think is more important to sustainability? Having a supportive administrator or having a strong PBIS team? Lots of people clicking in here. Give a little bit of time to think through this. And I will say, of course, that having both is very important. But if you had to choose one or another, and obviously schools that had both a supportive administrator and a strong team were the most likely to sustain. And do please, if you're listening in, make sure to mute your microphone so we don't have too much noise out there. As you can see, 90% people say in support of administrator, about 10% strong PBIS team. And I would tend to agree with you on that. And what we did was we've done this a few times, crunching through the numbers with different schools. This was one of our first large-scale ones, so we've had about 200 and over 250 schools looking at that. And we did a bunch of math. And here, I'm not going to explain all of that, but we did a bunch of pictures, and those pictures are not particularly helpful either. But coming back to that question, what we found that was most important to sustainability was actually this second one right here, having a strong PBIS team, which is really, really interesting. So this moves on to tip number one, and I'll describe that in a moment, and you'll see kind of the thinking behind this. But tip number one is keep a strong PBIS team. And you might think, why is that? It sure seems to me, and we certainly thought, that having that supportive administrator was the thing that would do it. And one of the things that we found was having a strong champion, and particularly an administrator, was a really strong predictor of getting PBIS in place in schools. So getting all of the pieces, implementing with fidelity, having all of the parts there, making sure it was a priority. But you know, a funny thing happens in schools, and that's that principals move on. And champions, even if they're not necessarily principals, move on. And so you might have one particular superhero who can throw the whole rest of her staff on her back and pull this off. But the challenge is the likelihood that that person is still going to be there in that role in a few years is very, very slim. You might be in a district that for some strange reason shuffles up every single one of their principals every 3 years. That's not the greatest move from what implementation science would say. But one of the things that I want you to think of is to be really careful. If you feel like, and here's the check for this tip, if you feel like you are in your school, if you're an administrator in your school, or if you're not, or a champion in your district, if you feel like you are the superhero who is pulling this stuff off on your own and kind of leading the way, but putting everybody on their back, then watch yourself. Okay? And the idea from this is that if you were to leave, here you are, you're the superhero. If you were to leave, what would happen to your systems? And that's kind of the power of that team, right? So here's a little poll for you. Thinking about your current initiatives, so this is either for you in your school, or you can think about this in your district. Is there one person whose departure might threaten the sustainability of your initiative? You think about that for a moment. Is there one person where it might fall apart because that person is really running the show at the school or at the district level? All right, we're about half and half on here. And I want you to just keep kind of thinking about that. If you're in that, so it's tacking up a little bit. So if you're in that roughly 55% of people asking this, you've got to make a big change, okay? So start building into your action plan what you're going to do to get that person to share their knowledge with other people, to disperse the tasks amongst the team as opposed to having one person doing it all the time. You just want to be really careful that people know it really, really well. And I'll share with you one thing that one of our super long sustaining schools and districts. This is a school in a district, a school within a district that's been implementing PBIS for 20 years. And here's one of their strategies that they do. They bring in, anytime there's a new teacher in the school, they ask them, sometimes very strongly, for them to be on the PBIS team. And what that does is it brings some fresh ideas, it keeps things exciting, and it also allows those veterans to cycle off. And then when that team is presenting to the whole staff, they know that there's at least somebody friendly in the audience who is going to say, yes, I totally support what you're doing. I think we should absolutely do it. And I think that part is key. One of my doctoral students, Teresa Andreo, did her dissertation looking at that school district that I was describing before. And this is a quotation from an interview. First-year teachers are overwhelmed, but we kept saying, you know, we'd love to see you at a meeting, you know, it would really help out. And so then when they go there, it just automatically includes, you need to start understanding how it really works. One of the things that we know is that teachers, first-year teachers, regularly report that their pre-service teacher training has left them unprepared for supporting the behavior of students in their classrooms. And so if you've got a team whose job it is to support behavior of students and support adults in doing that, then by all means, you really ought to think about having those new people in there and having those people continuing to cycle out so you don't end up in that superhero situation with one person who's saving it all. All right, moving on to tip 2. So tip 2 describes something called fidelity of implementation. So unfortunately for me and unfortunately for my family, I end up flying a lot on airplanes. And I don't mind it too much, but I'll tell you the first thing that I do when I walk onto an airplane, other than maybe looking and seeing if I can still fit my bag in the overhead compartment, is I actually look, instead of right, I look left. And I look inside the cockpit. Here's the co-pilot here. And you can see she's got a plane with a lot of dials, a lot of knobs, a lot of levers, a lot of data staring her in the face. And here's something else she has. She has a checklist of everything that she needs to do to fly that plane. This is the checklist. She goes through each one of them one by one. She's actually going to check it off with that pen. And everything's got to be done absolutely correctly before they push back. They've got to check this dial and that one. You don't have to worry about that one so much right before you get off. So these are all things that are helping her do her job and keeping her safe. Because it's pretty complex, flying a plane. So here is a school team doing the exact same thing. This school team is looking at their fidelity of implementation data. They are getting their scores. They're using a tool called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI, and they are using that as the checklist for flying the plane. And one of the things that's really key, I think, is that that plane, that cockpit on the left looks pretty complex, and flying a plane looks pretty complex. But I am going to argue that trying to implement an initiative consistently in a school over a few years is more complex than flying a plane. It's actually pretty hard to do. And that's where that fidelity of implementation checklist, the guide, the measure, the tool comes in. It's fidelity of implementation, if you didn't know, the extent to which the critical features of PBIS are implemented as intended. And if you implement enough of the critical features, you're more likely to get change in student outcomes. So there's 2 really good reasons for us to give a go at fidelity of implementation. Number 1 is if we put more stuff into place, it actually helps us improve outcomes for students. Number 2, when we start seeing where is the spot where we start saying, oh, that's sort of in place, or that's a 2, but that's a 1, that's when we start adding things to our action plan and move on and move forward with the idea of putting every single thing in place. So I'll ask you a question. let's go back to that pilot idea. When the pilot's looking at that checklist and she's not entirely sure, but she sure thinks that she might feel good if she actually says, yes, I've done it. Is that a good call that she's making? I don't think so. But I'll say another thing too. Does that pilot get to 70% of the things on that list checked off and say, you know what, that's pretty good. I think that's good enough. I'm just going to go for it. No. We want to get up to 100%. So we want to be really, really careful about taking that fidelity of implementation data, and that's our tip number 2, and instead of just saying this is a checklist that we've got to go through and we've got to send it to our district and then we're going to be done with it, really, really use it to improve outcomes in your school. So that means being super honest. If you're not doing a great job with some of the things, make sure that you're actually laying it out there and being honest with it. But then also, don't just assume that hitting 70% or 80% is automatically going to do it. All right. So here are a bunch of tools that you can use, including that one at the bottom, the tiered fidelity inventory is our latest and greatest. And you can do all 3 tiers all in kind of one common format. And you can download and enter all of these for free at PBISapps.org, which is supported by the National Technical Assistance Center. So it's your tax dollars at work, making that available for free for you. I'm going to show you just a little example of that connection between fidelity of implementation and student outcomes. This is I was working with a school, and they had a principal left who was the champion who had brought it in, and everybody was a little worried about whether this was going to keep going. And a coach came in. The coach was like, you know, I really like this PBIS thing, but I really don't like these positive referrals. I think they're, you know, I was told in my teacher training program that they're bribery, that they're going to make the student a terrible person. I'm really not very convinced that that's a good thing that we ought to be doing. So we said, well, let's look at your data. Let's look at your fidelity of implementation data. And what he'd done, this school actually collected and counted all of their positive slips, which I don't always recommend. The most important part is that you use them, not necessarily that you count them all up. And please don't count them if that means you'll use less so that you have less to count. That is not a good idea. So what they did is he made this chart of looking at their positive slips each year and looking at their office discipline referrals. So the orange line, the orange line is their positive referral, their use of positive referrals, and the blue bar is major office discipline referrals. When he saw that, he said, "Wow, what we do with kids, this core feature of PBIS is actually, I can see, is really, really making a difference." And so he was much more bought into that idea then. So one of the checks for tip 2 about using your fidelity of implementation data is anytime your team meets, you should know what your score is, and you should know what your next action plan step to implementing all of the parts of PBIS is. What's your next step to get to 100%? Don't use this, well, we hit the criterion that the district said, so that's good enough. That would work okay if you only want most of your students to be successful. You know, that would be okay if you want to land most of your airplanes safely, but certainly not all. So always have that in mind. If you do a fidelity assessment and you don't do action planning right after or the meeting after that, then you're not doing it right. All right, so moving on to tip 3. Tip 3 is a little bit similar to tip 2. One of the things we found is that schools that used their discipline data did better. But there was something that was really important. So here's some data. Here's a graphical depiction. I don't know if anybody can guess what this is. You don't have to guess in the chat box if you don't want to. But this is a map of all of the pubs in the UK. Not particularly useful for making decisions, other than knowing that no matter where you go, you're probably going to find a pub. But maybe parts of the Outer Hebrides up there. In the same way, if your school discipline data is just a list of all of the infractions, that is not going to be particularly useful for you understanding what are the patterns out there, how to make improvements. If all you do is fulfill a requirement to send it to the district, not particularly helpful. What you really need is a discipline data system that lets you take these data that you enter and turn it into pictures that are useful for decision making. So one example of that is the School-Wide Information System, or SWPBIS, that we've developed at the University of Oregon. And what you've got here is right as soon as you open SWPBIS, you see a dashboard that tells you what are our patterns of referrals by time of day, by location, by day of week, by problem behavior, by grade level, by student. And you can drill down and start looking specifically. So you can see that big spike in referrals that is happening around 1 o'clock in the afternoon and start saying, what's happening then? Where are those referrals happening? What's the behavior that we see? And you can start making better decisions. So tip 3 is use your school discipline data. Sometimes that means arguing for needing a usable school discipline data system. And there's lots of ones out there that allow you instantaneous graphing of your data so you can actually use it for decision making. But let me give you a little bit of an example of this. This is a school in Vancouver, Washington. And they looked at their office referral data. And what they found was that they had lots more referrals on the playground than in the classroom. And if you didn't know this, you could think about across elementary school, but also school-wide, where do the vast majority of referrals come from in schools? And meaning the most common location. And the most common location is the classroom. Students spent more time in the day there. There are more adults there. Sometimes we ask them to do things they don't want to do there. So it makes perfect sense. If you see another area that's higher than the classroom, then that is a significant point of data for you to take a look and say, we need to make changes in that area. So here's what this the school counselor here, who's also the PBIS team lead, did. He built something called the Playground Challenge. The Playground Challenge was using their data that he checked their data systems, and every time each one of these grade levels had a recess without an office discipline referral, he put a little link in the chain. What he told everybody is when the links reached the floor, then they would have a party. And there would be an extra recess. So some of the things that are interesting about this is, number one, this display was placed right by the door to the playground. So it naturally sparked conversations among students about, are we going to make it this time? How many more do we have to go? We really got to make sure not to run up the slide this time. We really got to use our cool down strategies, whatever those were. And here's what they found. Huge drop in referrals on the playground, but also a huge drop of referrals in the classroom too. And you could probably think about lots of reasons for that. What the teachers said was, wow, students come in, they're happier, they come in, they're ready to learn, they had a positive experience. I'm not doing conflict resolution with these students. I'm not chasing them down, trying to get them in. They just had a good time and were ready to roll right away. The problems on the playground did not roll over into the classroom like they used to. So here's an interesting check on that use your school discipline data. And this one's really interesting, and I think this one was a little bit of a surprise to us. Obviously, it's important. Schools that are implementing PBIS really well are using their school discipline data, are looking at it, are doing it with their action plans. But sometimes it's just the school PBIS team that's actually looking at it. So here's a little check. When was the last time you shared your data, your discipline data, with all staff in the building? So here's something that was really interesting. We took a look at a few years ago, over 850 schools. We looked at a few things that were related to, that we thought might be related to sustainability using a tool called the SUBSIST, which I'll put a link to in just a little bit. But we were looking at which ones of these things were most related to schools' likelihood of still implementing PBIS down the road. So there are a bunch of demographics, years implementing PBIS, grade level, enrollment, urbanicity, whether it was in a city, whether it was in a town, whether it was rural, diversity of the student population, community poverty, and then some school team actions, access to a coach, number of coaching hours, how often does your team meet, how often are data presented to all school staff. So the strongest one up here was this one right here. How often are data presented to all school staff? The only demographic one that was related was grade level. High schools having lower sustainability scores, but actually presenting data to all school staff, that frequency was, believe it or not, that was a stronger predictor than grade level. It was a stronger predictor than anything else. The number 2 on there was how often the school team met. And so here's a little visual representation. These are these sustainability scores from 1 to 4 based on the frequency of sharing data with all staff. So that number 1 there is they shared weekly. Number 2, every other week, every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks, 4 times a year, 3 times a year, twice a year, once a year, and then less than once a year. And our sort of preliminary data across here says if you're down below this red dotted line, we start getting really worried about you. And so you can see how those schools that were sharing data more often were more likely to have other pieces in place to sustain. All right, which moves me on to the last tip here. And I had a student, Susanna Matthews, who did a really, really interesting study looking at implementation of different parts of PBIS and which parts were more likely to predict whether schools were sustaining 3 years down the road. So she was wondering if there are specific systems that were related to both sustained implementation and levels of problem behavior. And then in those systems, and I'll describe what those 4 systems were, which parts of the systems were most related to sustained implementation. So she used a tool called the PBIS Self-Assessment Survey, or the SAS, and here are the 4 systems: school-wide, non-classroom systems, meaning just any area around the school that wasn't a classroom, classroom systems, and individual student systems. And so what you looked at was which system best predicted sustained implementation using a different tool, the benchmarks of quality, or the BOQ, or the BOQ, if there are any Texans listening out there, 3 years later. And a little bit of a surprise to us, but it probably shouldn't have been a surprise. Classroom systems were the strongest predictor of sustained implementation 3 years later. How about which one most predicted lower office discipline referrals 3 years later? Turns out, same thing, classrooms. So it's really indicating classrooms seem to be important. And so, and then looking within the classrooms, there were a few specific features that were most predictive of sustained implementation. These are the 11 items of the classroom systems subscale of the SAS, or PBIS Self-Assessment Survey. You can take a look at these on here. I'm going to do this somewhat quickly, so if you want a lot of think time, you better read fast. But there were 3 of these that were most strongly related to sustained implementation 3 years later. All right, I've given you enough think time. Here they are. Number 1, expected behaviors acknowledged regularly. Number 2, instruction and materials match student ability. And number 3, access to assistance and coaching. Thinking about that, especially that acknowledgement thing. How often are we looking for and seeing and noticing and giving students descriptive feedback on their social and social emotional successes in the classroom? So tip 4 out of 4, implement PBIS in the classroom. So what that means, in a sort of boots on the ground feel of it, if your school expectations look like this, and your classroom expectations look like this, you know, it's like the free poster that you got from Scholastic, then you've got a little bit of a mismatch. You're not actually doing what's needed to link your class rules to the school-wide expectations. And it's not that hard. You know, any one of these can fit somewhere in there. You know, this one could be there, and that one could be that one, and this one could be here, and that one could be that one too, and that one would fit there, and that one would fit there, and there you go. So it's that using that language of the expectations. So one of the checks that I've got here for you, the last check, is, and there's a poll that comes with this, so think about this for a moment. You might have to do a little bit of math. In your school or in your district, roughly what % of the day are your students spending in the classroom versus everywhere else in the school? So go ahead and put it in here, either under 50%, 50 to 59%, 60 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 to 89, 90 to 99%. All right, so that's at least good enough. That's not everybody participating with that. That's okay. But you've got most people saying 80 to 89% of the time. So what I would say, let's round down to 80%. So if you've got a school, you're implementing PBIS, every part of the building beautifully except for the classroom, then your school is only 20% a PBIS school and 80% something different. So, okay, so how do we do this? How do we make these changes here? So here's one way of doing it. One of the things you can do is here's a school-wide matrix, and it's got all of the regular settings across the school, and then here's classroom over here, and classroom is blank. And so the expectation is, you know, everyone's going to have different specific examples that they want to teach. They're going to have different specific expectations or routines in their classroom. But the shared expectation that we've got is that everybody will actually teach the expectations in the classroom, and they'll use the ones that we've identified for everybody else in the school. Respect ourselves, respect others, and respect property in this case. Here's another way of looking at it. Here is a classroom routines matrix. So here are school values. This is a high school. Respect personal best and safety. So instead of expectations of you do this, it's really these sort of aspirational values that we've got. And the expectation is not that everybody has the exact same routines, but that they teach them. And one of the things that you find that's really interesting when you actually go through this is you identify that actually your expectations really change for arrival versus group work versus independent work versus whole group. And just think for a second about even what's expected in terms of what's okay for people talking, and how do people talk, and how do people get attention from somebody. And the idea is not for everybody to have the exact same one, but for everybody to have some systems. So here's a classroom that's got all of the routines laid out for you. And just like the lesson plans that you have in your school for teaching expectations across those, think about putting out, here's a lesson plan here for specific routines. So here is how to ask for assistance for difficult tasks. It is pretty common in my mind for people to get really annoyed because students request attention in the wrong way. But the question might be is, have we actually asked students that? All right. And do feel free, we're coming towards the end. I'm going to get to some question points in here in a moment. So if you've got some questions, you want to start filling up the chat box, please feel free and we can move toward that. Here's something interesting. This is a research study from a couple years back where some researchers took a couple different classrooms and they actually it's actually the same room, and they made it up either in classroom A with lots of engaging materials and stuff hanging from the ceiling and stuff like that, and then classroom B, which is they called the sparse classroom condition, just sort of mostly cameras in there. What they did is they taught lessons, and I want to ask you, in which one did students pay more attention to instruction, and in which one did students actually learn more at the end of the unit? So here's something that's kind of interesting. Think about environmental change here. Students in the highly decorated room spent significantly more time off task and had significantly smaller learning gains. So in terms of addressing classroom environment, be careful if you get too much stuff going on, because students might be more interested in the walls than they are in your instruction. I don't think you have to be totally in the completely sparse zone, but watch out. If you start filling up the walls and then you need to start hanging stuff off of the ceiling and things all over the place, think about what's needed there for here. All right, if you're looking for some great resources, there is a lovely book that is very approachable called Class-Wide Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. And I've got there's the full reference and the website for that. If you want something for free, there is a great classroom strategies guide on PBIS.org called Supporting and Responding to Behavior. It's really long, but what's nice about it is when you look at it online, you can actually click and it's very hyperlinked to go through the different sections. And there are elementary examples, secondary examples. It's a really, really good resource when you start digging into it. Really, really nice. And actually, Brandy Simonson and colleagues had a very nice School Climate Transformation Grant webinar a couple years ago on that. So you can actually see what that looks like from a presenter perspective in action. So leaving this to takeaways, you won't be surprised that I'm going to lay out the 4 ones that we went through. Keep a strong PBIS team. Collect and use your fidelity data. Use your school discipline data. And implement PBIS in the classroom. If you're really, really interested in this and you're using your fidelity of implementation tools and you think, gosh, our staff would really love another tool to use, another survey to complete, we built a checklist off of our research tool that's an action planning tool. It kind of looks like the team implementation checklist or the TIC, and goes through the items most related to sustained implementation. You can find that on my website and download that and use it if you'd like. So moving just really briefly, I know this is supposed to be about school teams, but how can district and state teams support school teams in the work that's going on? And because I don't see too many questions in the chat, I'm going to kind of continue through. I've got a few more slides to go through. But if you've got burning questions, you should definitely start asking them now. So one of the things that we found was it's very easy for school teams to assume that the district has much less of an influence, or the state has much less of an influence than we think. And that's really just not the case. My colleague Steve Goodman has this really nice example of talking about sailing and the difference between, I don't know if you're a sailor, but the difference between having the keel up and the keel down is the difference between sort of going off track and staying on track. I'm not much of a sailor, and I don't know how many people are sailors here. I will use another example, and that example is a football example. So for those of you who know football particularly well, I think of district and state systems like your offensive line. When you have a good offensive line, it looks like you have a superstar quarterback or a superstar running back, and they can just do no wrong, and it's amazing. And when you've got a not so good offensive line, your quarterback can't ever get anything done, nobody's ever open, running back just can't find any openings and make any movement. And so really district and state systems are this sort of silent, makes everything better in the background. Some of the things that we have found that are most important, I've already identified these for you at the school level. Effective and efficient teaming, collection and use of data, sharing data with the whole staff, and classroom PBIS systems. Surprisingly enough, those line up very nicely with your 4 tips. At the district level, having district training systems that are solid and coherent, providing coaching in a systematic way, having communities of practice so that school teams or school team facilitators or PBIS team chairs can get together and share horizontally as opposed to just receiving training. And then the other things that districts can do is maintain model sites for visits, meaning if somebody wants to know more about PBIS, you have got the exact place to show them how well it works and how students actually like it. And it's not all about making compliant robots. It's actually about building students with strong internal moral compasses and so on. At the state level, having a state leadership team that's solid and works well and representative. Having centralized training systems so you're not relying on random trainers from different places, and a standardized training curriculum that you know hits on the most important components of PBIS. And then also state teams that used what's called the leadership team self-assessment that comes from the PBIS blueprint did better than states that didn't use that. So I will go through. I don't see any questions here, so I'm just going to keep moving along with this here. So if you're interested in that PBIS team leadership team self-assessment, you can find it on pbis.org, and if you go to blueprints, hunt it down, click right there, you got it. And here's a little picture of it, what it looks like. Always starts with a leadership team. There are, at a district level, it's often the same team. Sometimes at a state level, you've got an executive team and an implementation team, or a cabinet team and an actually doing things team. There are a number of key functions that leadership team self-assessment walks you through, including building stakeholder support, establishing continuous stable funding, doing policy and systems alignment, and building workforce capacity. That workforce capacity is a little bit more in the state than it is in individual districts. Then the implementation functions, there are 4 of these. good training for schools, good coaching for schools, evaluation and performance feedback for schools, and having behavioral expertise to understand how it all works. All of those feed into those model sites. And at the district, you want to have model schools. At the state, you want to have model districts. And what you can see is those arrows are double-headed up there because all of that information feeds back to the team to improve those outcomes. So you can find that tool. You look at blueprints, if you are looking for that evaluation brief, looking at the benefit costs, you can go through evaluation and find evaluation briefs. Steal all sorts of great things from people who have posted stuff. And I thank you for your time. Much appreciated. Continue to do the great work that you do. And thanks again to all those schools that participated in the project and continuing to help us understand how best things work. If you're interested in the slides from here, they are already posted on PBIS.org. You just go to School Climate Transformation Grants, or SCTG, and you can get them right there and download and use them. Thank you very much for spending your time with me, and good luck in sustaining effective school practices and improving outcomes for students.